Remember, we're talking 1975 in Brazil, third world country. And the computer was an IBM 1130 that we programmed by punched cards in Fortran. You have to be careful what you say. There was no such thing as freedom of speech. Say too many bad things about the government and you might disappear. If you keep thinking of your idea as your idea, your project, it's only going to go so far. Anything that has any real impact is always the work of many people. Like in the real world, I remember once I heard from John Lennon, one thing he said. John Lennon said, "Life is what happens when you're busy making other plans."
Welcome to the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast, where we talk to computer scientists who immigrated from their home countries for study or for work or for other reasons. In these oral history interviews, you will find established and renowned computer scientists from across academia and industry narrating their experiences of immigrating from where they grew up to a completely different land, often the US. My name is Indy Gupta, and I'm your host. It's my pleasure to welcome Rico Malvar, that's the Brazilian Portuguese pronunciation, also known as Rico, to the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast. Rico Malvar is a distinguished engineer at Microsoft, where he leads the Microsoft Research Enable Group, which works on empowering people living with disabilities. He is very well known as a member of the US National Academy of Engineering and also a fellow of the IEEE. He's been at Microsoft for 24 years and running since 1997. I'll come back to his timeline a bit later. Before his current role, he was a chief scientist for Microsoft Research, managing director of Microsoft Research Redmond, and partner researcher and founder and manager of the Communications, Collaboration, and Signal Processing Group at Microsoft Research. He's also affiliate faculty at University of Washington. He's worked on many products that you may have touched if you use Windows products, including the Windows Media Audio Codec, the JPEG XR image codec, and he's also known for work on the lapped transform. He's also internationally renowned as a member of the Brazilian National Academy of Engineering and the Brazilian Academy of Sciences, and he's won many, many awards, including the renowned IEEE Claude Shannon Harry Nyquist Technical Achievement Award. Coming back to his timeline, before joining Microsoft in 1997, he was Vice President of Research and Advanced Technology at Pitcher-Tel from 1993 to 1997. And yet before that, he did his PhD at MIT, where he was from 1982 to 1986. Overlapping with that time, he was professor of electrical engineering at Universidade de Brasília from 1979 to 1993. Of course, that's the current capital of Brazil. And before that, he was at the other capital of Brazil, Rio de Janeiro, where he did his MSc. You did your MSc at Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro from 78 to 79. And before that, your BS at Universidade de Brasília. Welcome, Rico, to the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast. And thank you for joining us. And thank you for being willing to share your immigration story with us.
Thank you, Indy, for inviting me. It is a pleasure to be here with you.
So you went to middle and high school in Brazil in the 1960s and 70s and maybe a sliver of the 1950s. Tell us a bit about your childhood, where you grew up, and memories that you have of those times.
I was born and raised in Rio de Janeiro, so I started my life as a little kid in Rio. It was a lot of fun. Rio was very different, that we're talking more than 50 years ago. But I am a nerd. I've always been a nerd. I'm an engineer. I like to build hack stuff. And my dad nicely perceived that. And very early, when I was turning 8, on my 8th birthday, he gave me one of those electronic kits that comes with parts and a board and instructions to build simple amplifiers and radios. And I just loved it. And I start playing with that and I say, boy, I want to be an engineer when I grow up. And then it happened. When I was in junior high and high school, if there were a chance to have, there were like study groups on building amplifiers and circuits, I would buy those magazines, like electronics magazines and the newsstand, and they would come with a project, build an amplifier, and then I would go and build that thing, it wouldn't work, and then I would try to debug. So since very early, I knew that electronics was my thing, and that's where I started. Much later in life, then I decided computers are cool too, so I end up building a background on both. Yeah.
And were any of your parents involved with engineering, your dad or your mom?
Actually, yes, it's interesting. They had not gone to college before they got married. But when I was at about that time, they decided to go to college. So when I was 6, 7, 8 years old, I saw my mom and dad going to college. And they finished a degree in statistics. And then later they got graduate degrees in the statistics. And then many years later, that's why we moved to Brasilia, because they actually went there to be professors and they founded a statistics department at University of Brasilia. So they very much had appreciation for advanced courses and studying, and they always supported me very much. And they were great examples for me.
So you grew up essentially in a house with two professors. Also, not just professors, you grew up when they were going to graduate school. So you've experienced it as an observer, graduate school, and also the professor life.
Not only experience, but there were some funny examples. Like we would have a dinner conversation because my dad was much more a statistician on the Bayes camp of probabilities, and my mom was much more of a on the Fisher frequentist side. And sometimes they would discuss about that during dinner, and there I was, a 12-year-old kid, and what are they talking about?
And those left an impression on
They did. And I loved statistics very early in college days. I took advanced courses. Yeah, they did have an influence on me.
you. Mentioned playing with electronic kits at home. What about school? How was the science and engineering, or science and math rather, education in your middle school and high school?
It was pretty good. I think especially in high school, where they had special courses for people who might not even want to go to college. So more like technical formation. And they had technical courses on electronics. And I say, I want to take those. And then I remember my teacher at the time saying, but you're planning to go to college, aren't you? I say, yeah, but if I go to that technical course, I get to play with circuits and stuff. So I want to do both. So I went there. So by the time I got to college and I went to a bachelor in electrical engineering, I already had some experience in transistors and building little circuits and signals and cables and things like that because of what I had done in high school, which was a good thing because then I was more prepared to play with building things. I always like to build things. I love theorems and math and reading and all of that, but ultimately I like to build stuff.
There were classes for those, there were vocational and technical classes, and there were other kinds of classes.
Yeah, so in high school, I took one of those technical classes, which would have qualified me to be a technician or to take some electrician or electronics repairman position if I wanted to, but I did that just to learn more about the practical things. But I knew I wanted to go to college, especially because we lived in Brasilia and there is a good federal university there, and we knew tuition would be free. So there was no cost. I mean, my family was not that rich, so they would not have been able to afford tuition. But since it was free anyway, so all we needed is desire and capability, and I work hard to get in.
Not all the students or many of the students in your class actually took those technical vocational classes.
Now, a few did, and a few did because they really didn't plan on going to college. So I had some good friends who did some of those hacking things with me. Some of them continued with college, some did not.
Okay, a different line. When in your life did you encounter your first computing machine or computer?
I was already in college. It was my second year of college. It's the first time I took one of those scholarships for students for research purposes. So universities always have this. It was one of those undergraduate research opportunities. And I applied for and I got it. And I remember with Professor Carlos de Moura, who was a professor in the mathematics department, more on applied math. And I talking to him and say, "Oh, Rico, we can use the computer here." And I say, "Aha, computers, that sounds good, because math plus stuff that you build and work. So I'm not going to build a computer, but I'm going to get to play with the computer." So it was great, because then I got introduced to numerical math, applied calculus, and he was a great advisor. I still am in touch with him to this date. Just the other day, he's been retired a long time ago, but it's nice to see that, after all these years, 50 plus years, we're still in touch. And that's how I got introduced. And the funny thing is that the computer, remember, we're talking 1975 in Brazil, third world country. And the computer was an IBM 1130 that we programmed by punched cards in Fortran.
Punch cards, yes. Most of our listeners haven't seen one, let alone use one. Tell us more.
In fact, I was not even entitled to type on the machine. I had to write carefully in coding sheets, send those sheets to the people who would then type on the machines. So I was not able to actually type. They didn't have enough terminals for the students to type. So they have professional typists, and we would have to write by hand our code.
So there were only certain people who were certified to type and essentially create the punch cards.
Exactly. Yeah.
How long did it typically take for computation to finish once you submitted the punch cards?
Oh, it was typically like, that's a good question. We would submit it, and then they would say, "Yeah, come back tomorrow, maybe in 2 days." And your tiny little program will be ready a couple of days from today, which was completely crazy. But, that's how we started 50 years ago.
The output of the program would also be on punch cards?
Typically, the output would be printed. They would say, don't write programs that generate more punch cards, just do printouts. And then again, we would have to go to a room and ask somebody, "Do you have a printout for me?" And then that's how we knew if the program. And every now and then, the program did not run correctly, and they say, "Oh, you got the printout. Oh, there's a bug. 2 more days to run it again." So the productivity was very low.
Finding bugs in programs must have been really, really hard back then.
It was.
What stage in your career did you stop using punch cards and move to the new kinds of computers?
That was 75. Then 2 years later, I was graduating. And then 79, a few years later, after my master's, the master's was mostly theoretical. But then I was back to being more practical. But at that time, we had terminals. So the university, so now I'm talking 1979. We had a new computer, the Burroughs computer, which was much better than the tiny IBM, and it had terminals. So we started programming with terminals, with a very simple operating system, much simpler than the Linux of today. But it's good enough that we start thinking about files and typing and things. So then it became easier.
So just in a few years.
I moved back to the more normal, go to the terminal and do your program there and see the results instantly.
So returning a bit to your timeline, especially middle school and high school, you mentioned the vocational technical classes that you took. Were there other elements of the schooling itself which you think prepared you very well for your future career as an electrical engineer and as a computer scientist more broadly?
Well, some of them are, yes, and some of them are like, for example, I had good professors that saw in me the teachers that, for example, the teacher that taught language, Portuguese, and the teachers that taught math. My math teacher, he was really great, and he saw that I had all that interested, and he motivated me quite a bit. And he is the one who first started introducing in me the concept of research, that because until then I would go to school is that, okay, we do whatever the teacher says. If the teacher says read this thing, you read this thing. And if the homework is chapter 7 of the book, you read the chapter 7 of the book. But then thanks to to that teacher is like, no, 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 no. You go beyond that. You go read other books. You ask yourself, ask your brain what you're interested on, and you go find more. School is very limiting. You can only learn this little from school. You need to learn more. And I start getting, that was good advice. And that really motivated me. And since high school, I was always like that. I was looking for other books and other magazines to learn more. And on the Portuguese side, the teacher, she was great. She really taught me that, look, language is not just this boring thing that you have to know grammar and all of that. It's how you express and how to communicate. And you're going to be an engineer. I know that's your dream, but everybody needs to communicate well. So read a lot, know more about how to express yourself verbally in writing, because that's important. And I was fortunate because I think those were two good pieces of advice that I got back in the high school days.
Science and math classes, and actually all your classes, I presume they were taught in Portuguese, or was there English as well involved?
At that time, all the way to my master, to the bachelor, everything was taught in Portuguese. But typically, as we got to midway through college, then the books would be written in English. So it was a requirement that you had to at least be able to read English. But the discussions, the classes themselves, all in Portuguese.
Were your parents supportive of your interests in electronics, electrical engineering through your high school and then also into your college days?
Yeah, very much so. To the point where sometimes I would negotiate with mom and dad. I mean, I'll have a small allowance and then I say, oh, but I'm building this very fun circuit here and just need to buy a few more transistors. Can I have a little more money so I can finish my thing? And they would smile at me and they would actually give me the extra money. So that was one among many things they did to really try to motivate me. They loved the idea that I want to be an engineer. I would be like the first in the family to be an engineer. They loved that idea and they gave me as much support, always saying, look, you're going to need math and you're going to need statistics. There's some physics as well, of course, but you're going to need math and statistics. And of course, yeah, you're right, of course, I'll study those as well.
This is the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast interview with Rico Malvar, distinguished engineer at Microsoft and member of the National Academy of Engineering. So moving forward in your timeline, so it's 1974 and you go to the Universidade de Brasilia for your BS, and then 2 more years after that at Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro for your MS. And then right after that, you became a professor. I'll ask you a little bit about that. You also mentioned that you essentially went to your local university because the tuition was free for the locals. Tell us a bit about your bachelor's program in electrical engineering. At what point of time do you think, you already mentioned earlier that research was something that was ingrained in you by your math teacher. At what point of time did you think this thing called research is potentially interesting and something that I might want to do?
It's a good one. And it was really about college. And as I mentioned to you, when I took that undergraduate research opportunity doing numerical calculus and things, and then both my advisor and me said, well, we do like to explore things. And then he told me a little bit more about what is research. See, people do research, they go beyond, they study things, they invent things, they write papers about those things. And then he would actually carefully select a few papers that even I, midway through college, would be able to read and understand to some. See, this is kind of what a researcher does. You could do well on that. And I had some mixed feelings because I felt I would be more building things as a true engineer in the real world. But being a researcher was also cool. And I figure, and then he would tell me, you can be both. Why don't you study enough, go through grad school, become a researcher, and then try to apply that in the real world, because then you can maybe do more advanced things. And I said, okay, that's a good thing. So at that time, the more I spoke to him, the more I built the idea, I think I want to go to grad school. And then my parents, of course, said, but of course you want to go to grad school, so go for that. So it was like that. So by the time I finished college, it was pretty certain, okay, as long as I find the opportunity and I qualify for, I'm going to go for grad school. And that's why I went to Rio, because they had a very good master's program. And that, especially at that time in Brazil, people would really first do the master's and then think if they want to do a PhD or not. Very rarely somebody would go in already to do a PhD and get the master's along the way. It was more like, I'm going to a master's program, and that's another story if I want to do. So I took a step at a time, and I did the master's first. Then I came back to Brasilia, started teaching a little bit, applied for a scholarship to come to the US to do the PhD, and that's how it happened. So I did master's, worked a little bit as a entry-level professor for 3 years, and that's when I took off to do my PhD.
Was there a PhD program in Brazilian universities back then?
Yeah, actually, there was, and at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, not that great. It's a lot better now. They were in the early days of putting together a PhD program. So my master advisor, with whom I have kept in touch as well, he always said, look, you can get a great master's program here. We have a good program. We're good professors, but if you want a PhD in signal processing, you're going to have to go to the US or Europe. You need to leave because we don't have programs at the right quality. So he also advised me well.
And it was common for universities to hire faculty with a master's degree?
Today, no. Today is just like here. Your PhD is a requirement. But at that time, because there weren't that many people with PhDs, they would say, look, we will hire you at the assistant professor level, not on a tenure track, right? So you're not counting years for tenure, but you can already be here in the faculty and start learning to be a professor and all of that. But then within a certain period of time, you have to start a PhD program. If you don't start, you're out. On the other hand, if you do start in a good school, you get a leave of absence to go get your PhD, come back, and then you come back on a tenure track position. And that's roughly the path I took.
It sounds like it's a stepping stone by the universities to encourage young aspiring researchers to get a PhD.
Exactly. And the equivalent of NSF in Brazil, the CNPq, they actually created, at that time, it was actually quite big program of scholarships to pick up the best young folks in Brazil and give them the scholarship so they could go to places like MIT and other places. And in fact, when I went to MIT, I had a whole set of colleagues from Brazil. There were like 20 of us or something like that.
So somewhat along those lines, I want to ask, so from your batch, the BS students batch, Bachelor of Sciences class, in electrical engineering, what fraction of them would you say went to graduate school and what fraction of them did other things in their professional career?
Well, it turns out that employment opportunities in Brazil were quite limited at that time. Today is much better because, the world is flat and there's less difference among countries these days. But at that time, it was difficult. So the percentage of folks who actually continue with an engineering career was only maybe 20%. Other people would say, okay, I have an engineering degree, but there is a job here in the government being an accountant. I'm going to take that. I'm going to take some accounting courses. I'm going to take that because that pays well. And I couldn't find a job as an engineer. And I would say a small percentage, maybe 5%, I'm not sure, but probably not much more than that, like me, went off and continued their studies on grad school, roughly speaking. Today, the percentages are a little better because we have the programs there. There's a much more vibrant industry to absorb the people and so forth.
So back then, many studied engineering because they were interested in it. However, there was not really a job market for.
Not really a path to be an engineer, really a professional engineer. So they did something else.
So if you went to your local office, the accountant or whoever is running the office there, you might meet them and they might actually turn out to be an engineer, very well trained.
Exactly. And that was actually quite common, as much as almost half the class.
So Brazil had quite a bit of a constitutional upheaval in the 1960s, and then there was also military rule from the 1960s to the 1980s, and this overlapped quite a bit with you growing up. Yeah. Did those affect your study and your plans?
It didn't affect my studies, really. It was okay, but it actually had an interesting social psychological impact because it had some level of resilience to me. So going to college and literally having tanks from the army driving around the college because there is some potential revolution being cooked inside the university. We were a little afraid, but very quickly that became part of life. And it was like, okay, the life is strange and you gotta be careful because at that time during the military regime, you have to be careful what you say. There was no such thing as freedom of speech. Say too many bad things about the government and you might disappear. And lots of people did. And not that of course, we hated that, we didn't like that, but having to live through that gives you some level of resilience. So that's the only silver lining. But fortunately, later in the 80s, democracy finally won. And Brazil became a true democracy with a constitution and an elected president. So it was kind of fun for me. And I was 31 when I finally got to be able to vote for president. But it was a special time when we switched from the 80s to the 90s. Okay, now we are a democracy.
Did the funding to universities or the support for education change at all during the military rule?
One interesting thing is that the military folks, the leaders there, they knew that education was important. So they always invested well. In fact, they started with the concept of the federally funded universities, which became really a big collection spread all over the country. And those are the ones where I studied. And then later, under the democratic regime, people say, well, we need to preserve that. So they did a good job as much as possible. But it's still, proportionally speaking, if you look in percentage of the gross product of the country that is spent in education and research, it's not the same as the level as the US, and it could get better. And part of what the National Academy of Engineering in Brazil, the Academia Nacional de Engenharia, tries to do is try to push the government to increase the investment in education and research, especially in science and technology. And more recently, I think there has been a little bit more appreciation to that because everybody is seeing, like we do see in the world, the importance of technology, right? We live with technology all the time. Everybody carries a tiny little computer that they also call a phone, and you can't live without that thing anymore, right? The pandemic came, and without Teams and Zoom and all those tools, we couldn't live our lives anymore. So people are beginning to understand, we need to. So it's getting a little bit better, but there's room to grow.
So turning to your timeline from 79 to 82, you taught at the university in Brazil. Was that just teaching, or were you also starting to do research?
Yeah, a little bit of research as well. Not that much at that time before I had the PhD. I did a lot more research after I came back from the PhD. But even before, I did a little bit. So in the same, remember I told you back in undergrad, I had those undergraduate research opportunities. So I was actually advising students in the same way, undergrad research. So I was not teaching grad courses at that time because I couldn't, only undergrad. But I had fun with the kids doing, let's build a little stereo FM transmitter circuit, right? Which at that time was a big deal. And that time you could build such things with actually circuits, right? These days, things like that is only one tiny little chip that does everything. But at that time, it was a little more fun. You would build the discrete components. So we had that, and then teaching classes. A fun thing was the very first class that I was supposed to teach when I was hired. It was March of 1979. I just started and I say, okay, Rico, you're going to teach base electronics. You know electronics well, should be easy for you. I say, oh, of course. But a month before it started, a professor left, and that professor was scheduled to teach advanced digital sequential machine design, which was a final year digital, not analog circuit. And they said, ooh, Rico, we lost the professor to teach that, and you learned something along those lines because we saw you study that during your masters. Can you teach that? And I said, I'll do my best, but funny thing, I get into the class, the first day of class, I realize, I look at the roster, I look at the kids, and this is like final year, right? I was the youngest person in the room. So that was a kind of a funny way to start, but it worked out all right. So I learned with them and they were patient with me.
And did you adapt naturally to the role of being the youngest in the room, but possibly the most knowledgeable?
I think so, because I tend to be very pragmatic and I don't pretend to be more than I am. So I made it very clear to them, guys, I just finished a master here. I'm not really a specialist on this thing, so be patient with me. I think they appreciated the bluntness. And at the end, it worked out all right. And it actually, I worked really as hard as I could to learn that subject. So at the end of that semester, I actually knew that material pretty well. But I actually learned with them, basically.
One of the perks of teaching, that one can also
The
learn while
perks.
teaching. So in 82, you came to the US for your PhD at MIT. What was the most difficult thing to adapt to in the first few weeks, months after you came to the US?
As expected, because I was, I would always read a lot about books and magazines, things in the US. I would read as much as I could, talk to a few people. I had a few friends who had visited the US and knew about the US. I had a couple of friends from the US, so I could practice my English with them. But it was actually the first time I traveled to the US was when I went to MIT to become, to start my studies there. And then the first thing that shocked me is that I had this experience of always being the best kid in class and, things like that. And I get to MIT and I was like, whoa, this is really hard here. Everybody is so good. I'm just an average guy here. So I'm going to have to work doubly hard to do well here. But so that was the first thing I said, ooh, this is going to be hard. But then, like anybody, I think anybody who went to a good school like MIT, I felt so fortunate. I said, wow, this place is wonderful. I would walk the corridors and go by the departments, talk to people, and say, wow, they do so much great stuff here. That's a great place. I'm very fortunate to be here. But it took a while until I felt comfortable. For the first year, everything was a little too hard, but I just, put up with it. And it was a bit tricky because at that time I was already married and my wife and I already had our first little kid, my daughter Anna. So going to grad school, and then she decided and got a scholarship to do a PhD as well. So as we get to the second year, here we are, two grad students. She was at Boston University, I was at MIT, two difficult courses, and at the same time having to raise a 2-year-old kid. It was tricky, but we survived.
How did you manage the handoff protocol of taking care of the kid while also taking classes and doing work?
It was tricky. We did our best, but sometimes we'd say, honey, I have to study harder because I have a test in 2 days. And she would say, me too. I'd say, whoops. So sometimes we wouldn't do as much studying as we would like because of that. But it turns out that, interestingly, MIT had actually a nice program. There were many people in similar situation as us, so they actually had separate housing for families. So we were able to give our daughter a semi-normal life, right? Because we would have friends and other kids and a playground. So from her perspective, hey, I'm a kid just like any other kid. She didn't see all the struggles, of the parents trying to study and stuff.
We see a lot of grad students in US universities who have kids as they're doing their MS or PhD. Do you have advice for them for things that they should do, do's and don'ts advice?
I hate giving advice because I always think every person is a different situation, right? But one thing we learned, both me and my wife, is that to be patient and to try to negotiate the time and be careful to allow time for the kid, right? And figure out some interesting things to do with the kid, participate in the kid's education and all of that, even knowing that you have to pay a price, right? Oh, I could do this extra thing in my paper if I could study a little more. You say, no, but I won't, because I need that time to do something with my kids. So try to find that balance, because, in the same way that you only go through grad school once, hopefully, you only have your kid once, right? Your kid goes through their upbringing only once, so you got to be careful to find the right way. And most of us, the students with kids, we struggle to find that balance. Is not easy, but try your best to find. It's actually the thing that we conclude, as you said. You see that in many schools, and it is doable. You can do your grad studies with a kid. I remember a couple who was a friend of ours, they had 2 kids, so they had double the trouble. So
With classes, research, and also a family, did you have time for a social life, to hang out with friends at all?
little bit. I remember the poker club and other things, but very few, because there wasn't really that much time left. Yeah.
And so you finish your PhD at MIT fairly quickly. 4 years is fast, even today, but definitely was fast back then. But were there any tricks to finishing it quickly?
Oh, very. That was a very simple formula. And I remember telling my advisor when I was looking for advisors, and fortunately there were like 3 professors willing to take me, and say, wow, good. And finally, when I went to Professor Dave Stalin, with whom I did my work, he was such a wonderful man. I learned, he has passed, unfortunately, several years ago, but I learned so much from him. And I remember the conversation having with him. It was very easy, which was the following: Dave, I would love to work with you. He was very blunt with me. He'd say, Rico, you want to do signal processing? I don't know that much, but I'm willing to learn with you, and I have some good ideas what we can do with it. I say, that sounds good. This is a good guy. But I said, but Dave, if you take me, I have to finish in 4 years, because I have a scholarship for 4 years. And there's no way my family can afford 1 year of tuition at MIT. So build something for me here, accept a short thesis, because I need to finish in 4 years. He said, okay, let's make it work.
So just to back up, so this the Brazilian government and the university essentially paid for your PhD.
Yeah, I had that graduate scholarship that paid the tuition, but they were very clear, because they say, okay, we pay for 4 years. If you take a 5th, you're on your own.
And was it a part of that agreement that you definitely needed to come back to Brazil as a professor?
And that's why I came back, because it's not enforceable, but, ethically, the rules were, if you spend X number of years doing your PhD, you have to go back and spend at least the same number of years teaching or giving back to society the money we spent. Giving back something to society, because we spent the money on you. And I end up spending 7 years or so in Brazil after I finished my PhD.
Right. So you came back in 1986, and this was back to your earlier job as professor.
Exactly.
Was there a difference you saw in yourself in terms of how you approached your job as a professor before and after your MIT PhD?
Water to wine, huge difference, because I learned so much at MIT. What does it really mean? Even things like how to do a better job running an undergraduate research opportunity program, how graduate research worked, how to do the good balance on how to teach the students the subject, but how to actually teach them to become researchers on their own, the ones who are interested. All of that would have been at that time very difficult to learn in Brazil. And I learned that. So not just the subject matter, but how does a good university work, what it means to be a good professor, and how to advise the students. So I tried to learn, not just me, but my generation of folks who did what I did. We tried to bring the best ideas. And that was the goal of the program, of the scholarship program. And that actually worked quite well. Me and many friends of mine did the same thing, and we became the generation that helped create graduate programs in Brazil in engineering and bump up the quality of engineering education in Brazil, because all of us learn from the US or Europe or other places and bring that experience to Brazil. So in that sense, I think the program was reasonably successful.
And your style of doing research, I presume, also changed quite a bit after your PhD.
It did. MIT taught me to be pretty rigorous on theoretical things. They are tough over there. But at the same time, they show me that in one hand, they really push for hard math and build sophisticated math models of whatever you're working on. But at the same time is that look for advances that actually lead to new technologies. And if those advances are quite promising, we can even potentially build a company around those. And as you know, MIT is so many startups come up from there. And I actually got involved with one of them, which was Picturetel. So that concept as well, that what we learn from school, we can actually apply to build a new company and things like that. And that was something that we brought back as well.
At what point of time did you start to get involved with Picturetel?
I was almost done with my PhD. So I was in the final year. I was just finishing the thesis, and then my friends and my advisor together decided to start the company. And then my two friends decided to not finish their PhDs because they said, no, we want to do the company. I just got the master's, was going to start the company. And then Brian, I remember, told me, Brian Hinman, said, Rico, you go finish the PhD and then you go work, you're going to work for us. I said, sure. And that's exactly what happened.
Sounds like you had a bit of an option to perhaps work in the company and not finish your PhD like some of your other fellow students, because that's something that students nowadays face as they're doing their PhD. There are sometimes lucrative opportunities to start their own company or get acquired or hired by another company. Is that a choice that you faced, or did you just not think of that as a choice at all?
And I did face that choice, but I realized I invested a lot of years here in getting to my PhD, and I want to finish it, not just because I want to finish what I started. There's a little bit of that, just a personal thing. If I start something, I want to finish the thing that I started. It was a dream. But also I saw, you know what? Having that degree and the knowledge and all the learnings that go with it will probably help me. So I don't want to stop it along the way. So instead of making money now by taking some good job now, I'll finish the PhD first and hopefully the money will come later and I'll be able to do more. So I kind of bet on that second path that the money will come later, and it actually did, so it was fine, and I don't regret it. I think I would have regretted if I had not finished my PhD at MIT. To this date, as you can imagine, if you have it's an asset, right? If you have a PhD from MIT, it's something that it brought you knowledge, it enriches your resume, it gives you more chances to do things, so I don't regret it a little bit.
You're listening to the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast interview with Rico Malvar, distinguished engineer at Microsoft and a member of the National Academy of Engineering. After returning to Brazil, you were a professor for the next 7 years, from 1986 to 1993. And in addition to your teaching and research, you continued being involved with Picturetel?
Actually, not that much. I finished a few things I was doing with them, but then only touching base a little bit, but I was really full-time at the university until one day they decided to call me and say, hey, do you want to come back here because we have a new position of director of research, you want to apply? And that's how after the 7 years I ended up, because I had told them, look guys, at least for 4 years I'm going to have to stay in Brazil anyway, so I might as well, if I'm doing something, I want to do that something right. So I want to invest my time. And I actually created the Signal Processing Research Group at the University of Brasilia. At some point, that group became very strong. It has one of the highest levels of funding at the whole university and all of that. And I say, okay, I'm doing that. Let me do that well. But then, as you said, 6, 7 years later, then came an opportunity and they say, okay, Rico, there's an opportunity here for you, potentially come back to be with us. What do you think? And it actually worked out.
That was your transitioning from academia to industry, but also you're coming back to the US a second time.
Right.
Let's talk about the first one. So both of your parents were professors. And so what was your internal thinking in moving away from academia?
As I was mentioning, I feel like I'm always an engineer first and a researcher later, and I am a hacker and tinker. I just finished assembling my newest computer here, which, it's a Dell computer, but I open it up, put new parts and stuff like that. So I still like to to fiddle with things. And I always felt that it's a different kind of impact that you can have in industry. And I have felt if I stayed in academia, I could have more impact, driving more interesting research, graduating good kids and helping their education and all of that. Those are all wonderful things. But I would miss on the opportunity to build things as real products. And I wanted to do that. So that's why I decided to make the switch. Because I figure if this doesn't work, I'll switch back to academia and hopefully they'll take me back.
So in your second stint coming back to the US, again, you were with Pichatel for about the same time same length of time that you were with MIT, 4 years, 93 to 97 with Pichatel. And then before that, you were with MIT as a PhD student from 82 to 86. Can you contrast those two experiences, apart from the fact that you were a second-time immigrant the second time around, but just the work culture of being in industry, first-time immigrant being in industry, first-time immigrant being in grad school. Can you contrast those two experiences?
It was very different because the culture is different. For example, one thing I notice is that people are much more business-like in the US. I'm overgeneralizing a little bit, but my first impression, at least, we would have a project meeting and things like that. We get to the meeting and people would immediately start talking about the project and things like that. And I was like, that's not how you run meetings. You're supposed to have a lot of small talk before. What about the soccer game last night? And then I realized, they don't play much soccer here. Yeah. So those cultural shocks. We run meetings differently. We do things differently. But in other hands, things are actually quite nice. I remember we would go to lunch together and, there's a new burger joint. Let's go in there. And then we would, small talk over there as well. So at the end, it wasn't that different. But one thing I realized is that here in the US, I saw there, and maybe to this day, this push to, especially on a startup company, which was my experience at that time, the push to go grab a market opportunity, make money, and all of that, the intensity of that seems to be stronger here than it is in Brazil. In Brazil, we tend to be, of course, there is a lot of that. There's advanced companies that were started there and so forth, but we seem to be a bit more laid back in Brazil. Yeah, let's work, but it doesn't need to be that hard. I'm exaggerating, and there's some Brazilians who say, hey, don't say that to me. I work really hard. And I did too as well. I had startups in Brazil. But there is a little bit of that, maybe because people see examples here in the US of the upside. They see, an Apple, a Microsoft. They started as a garage thing of a few guys, so I can go that far. It's more difficult in Brazil, somebody to imagine that I will start a garage thing and become one of the biggest companies in the country.
97 is when you left Pichatel. It did get acquired, right?
Not at that time. I left Pichatel because there was this possibility. At that time, there was Microsoft Research was in a very fast growing path, and then I realized, wow, maybe there's an opportunity to do something different. I had done a lot at Pichatel, that was cool, and then I say, would that be interesting to go to a bigger company, because it's not a startup anymore. It will probably be a different kind of experience, but a company that is showing an interest in investing in research and growing very quickly a research group. I got intrigued by that. And then I actually initiated the contact with Microsoft, and at the end I decided to make the switch, which was kind of funny on my family because first is move from Brazil to Boston, a huge move, and now move from Boston to Seattle.
East Coast to West Coast, yes.
So we're saying, oh, we have this rule in our family. If we move, it has to be at least 3,000 miles.
Big jumps only.
Big jumps only.
And are there differences in the work culture in the East Coast? You've experienced that, and also on the West Coast.
Very much in the here at just for fun here at Microsoft. I mean, many years ago, but to this day, you can go to a meeting where you're discussing, for example, technologies where you want a patent or license or something, and there will be some lawyers in the meeting, and some of those lawyers will be in shorts and very collared shirts. Typically, if you are in the same meeting in the East Coast, they're all in suits. But other than that, not much really. There is that, that thing. Okay, who has the best schools? Is Stanford the best school in engineering, or is it MIT? Or they're all very good. I don't think you can tell one from the other. They have the similar intensity. They have the similar let's drive opportunities for startups and things like that. I found very similar things in the community here in the West Coast versus the East Coast. It's more the culture and the societies. People here in the West Coast seem to be a little more relaxed and laid back than in the East Coast. Unless you go down in the East, if you go to the Southeast like Miami, then it flips. In fact, you go to Miami, you're going to bounce on many, many Brazilians because Brazilians love to go to Miami.
You joined Microsoft in 97, and essentially you've been there ever since, 24 years and running. And you've had very different roles, and your interests have also changed over time. Initially, you started off doing, the signal processing kind of work that you were familiar with, but over time you've changed roles quite a bit. Did that change come about because of your changing interests, or was it other reasons?
Like in the real world, I remember once I heard from John Lennon, one thing he said. John Lennon said, "Life is what happens when you're busy making other plans." Right? And other people may have said something very similar, which means life and career path, you plan up to a certain point, but at the end. So I started running my group doing signal processing technologies, and I also had some folks doing really nice work in information retrieval and other things. We even combined the two. We did lots of interesting things, and Microsoft always had, if something can be really influential, there are resources. I mean, sometimes an email, a well-phrased email gets funding for a significant project, which is typically in academia. It's not as easy as that. So there was that. But then later, after a few years, there were opportunities for me to grow more into the management side. Not only managing a group and doing a lot of technical work myself, half and half, but then it got a point where, okay, maybe you can manage the organization, or maybe you can manage a set of groups. And that's how I grew up to be an assistant director, and then at some point the managing director of the lab there. And I think it was a great experience. At that time, I was doing very little technical work, but it forced me to learn a diversity of themes because, if I manage the whole MSR lab at that time, 300 people, 30 different research groups, I have to know a little bit about, operating systems, architecture, human-computer interfaces, search, retrieval, databases. I can't just be a signal processing person. I had to learn a little bit of all those things, and I did, and I worked hard on learning that, so I could make reasonable decisions together with my managers of what to fund, how much to fund, and it was a great experience. And now I'm back to being more on a particular subject. So it's a combination of opportunities and a desire to have that life in management, which I don't regret. It was a good experience.
So the discussion so when I talk with students, oftentimes when they go on the job market, their approach is, well, I want to if they're going to industry, where I want to build things. And sometimes we have this discussion, I have this discussion with students about, eventually you're going to have to be a manager. And the word manager always gets their hackles up. They're like, no, I don't want to be a manager. But really what I'm trying to say is you want to be a leader.
A leader, correct.
And so I think if you can enlighten our listeners about that transition from being a cog in the wheel, a worker, a software developer, and making that transition to leadership, what are the things that they should look for in growing their career?
Yeah, that transition to leadership is really important. And even if you think, I'm not going to be a manager dealing with budgets and investment decisions and things like that, but I actually want to drive my thing, my project, I think very quickly people realize that if you keep thinking of your idea as your idea, your project, it's only going to go so far. Anything that has any real impact is always the work of many people, right? But having the right leader that can get all these people together and motivate them to understand what is the vision, what is the opportunity. So articulating that vision, articulating the opportunity, and more important, articulating the impact. Because you see a lot of people who figure, I could invent a gizmo that does this thing and that thing. Well, that's cool. That seems new, but would anybody benefit from being able to do this thing and that thing? Right? So think about the impacts. Think how that could actually impact society, impact systems, impact the user directly. And if you have those elements and you build a good story, learn to tell the story and build a good story, because then people will rally with you. Sometimes you will be the one rallying people. Sometimes you will join a rally because somebody else has a good story and you want to be part of that. But way before management, you really need leadership in that sense. Build a vision, build the opportunity. Why can you do something better than others? Why can you do something different than others? And why that matters ultimately? How would humanity or science, or what is the impact? Articulate the impact. And also try to do that in a way that you can explain to anybody what that impact is. You should be able, I always use my wife as a test. I explain to her what I'm trying to do. If she doesn't get it, oops, back to the drawing board.
Right now you're leading the group Microsoft Research Enable, which is helping users and humans with disabilities. Tell us a little bit about what the group is doing.
That was an opportunity that started about 5-6 years ago. And the idea is that for people with disabilities, sometimes being able to leverage the potential help from technology is difficult, right? And more often than not, and that can change, that's our dependency on technology is only increasing, right? More and more our lives need technology. Who can live without a phone? You can be a poor person in a poor country and you do your best to get your hands on a phone. Maybe a third hand, and these days it even has to be a smartphone. It has to have internet. But you pay $50 on a 3 generations behind phone, but you need one. So, and everybody needs tech, computers, phones, and everything, right? So, but that tech makes the life of people with disabilities more complicated, because sometimes the tech relies on you being able to see very well a screen full of detail, or being able to touch on a screen or control a mouse. But what if your hands cannot really control a mouse? What if your hands tremble and you can't touch the screen? Your brain may be great, you have great ideas, but the interface is getting in the way. So we saw an opportunity and we started working on projects and the company has wonderful things. For example, one thing that was not my team that did was the Xbox adaptive controller. Instead of having a very difficult to handle joystick thing, you have this big thing, this big piece of plastic with big places where you can touch with any part of your hand. So even if you don't have a hand, if you only have a stub because you lost it on an accident or a deformity, you can still play. And we have examples of kids who can actually play thanks to this thing. They would never be able to play with the joystick. And my team did some things like the eye control in Windows, where you can control everything in the computer with just your eyes. And there are some people, for example, people who have spinal cord injury or ALS, their limbs don't move, but the eyes move. So can I use the motion of the eyes to control the interface? And the answer is yes. It's a little less efficient, takes more time, but it's doable. So we have people who can go back and, run a spreadsheet, go have fun in Facebook just with their eyes.
This is the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast interview with Rico Malvar, distinguished engineer at Microsoft and member of the National Academy of Engineering. I want to return to the last segment of our conversation, which is a little bit of a retrospective. Let me start with a question about how do you handle rejections and any thoughts you have about imposter syndrome, which many researchers suffer with.
And ultimately, it comes down having good managers, good leaders, good professors that basically tell us, look, the business of research, the business of innovation is a business of failure. You're gonna fail most of the time. And you think you have a great idea, out of 100 ideas you have, 99, somebody already had that idea and already did something. But keep thinking, because on the 100th time, something sparks and something comes back. So, and sometimes you have a great idea, you start working in it, put it on a paper, the paper gets rejected. And then you start thinking, as you said, maybe I'm not good enough or things like that. No, don't think that way. Think like, a small analogy, not a very direct, but like sports, people in sports, right? They lose a game. That's fine. They go to the next game. And it's kind of the same in research. Think of it as a game. You lost a game, you go to the next one. And most of the stuff, especially now, after decades in my career, most of the things you do don't work quite as well as you thought they would. But a few sometimes surprise you and actually work better than you thought, and you achieve better impact. So failure is just part. The main thing is, don't be demotivated with the failure, but don't pay zero attention to it. When things fail, try as much as you can, understand why. So at least next time, you're less likely to make that mistake again, right?
The next question is a little bit hypothetical, but I want to ask it anyway. Imagining if you had gone back to Brazil and just stayed there as an academic, essentially for all these years, would your career have looked very different from what it has been?
Oh, indeed. That's a kind of really hypothetical. I have no idea, but I can tell you that a few things probably would be similar. First, I would continue pushing on, research in signal processing, trying to invent more things. Here in the US, I did more work on lapped transforms and other things and designing data compression systems using that. I would probably have tried to do the same in Brazil, because it doesn't really take that much funding to do that. So even with less money, I would be able to do that. And I would also try, because I did, to be involved with companies in innovation, with startups or maybe a bigger company. I would try to find a path to industry as well, because I think it's kind of in my brain and in my way of thinking. So that would probably be similar. But to achieve the level of impact that you can achieve when you are in a big company like Microsoft, it would probably be difficult. Here, sometimes we have projects where not only we can invest more, but that allows, for example, some of the work we do in search and information retrieval, just like our friends in Google or Amazon and other places. Sometimes to optimize the algorithms and to do the right thing, you need enormous data sets. in acquiring that data, storing that data, building computing systems that will work with that data, it's out of the reach of academia, right? There's no way academia can fund that. And in fact, we try, Microsoft, we do that, share some of that information back to academia, because we want to help academia, because that's where our next employees are going to come from, right? But I feel very fortunate to be in a company that one of the few that can invest at that level, so you can do things that would be super difficult to do in academia. Yeah.
I want to ask about your work with programs involving diversity and inclusion. You have quite a bit of involvement, as does Microsoft, with many of these programs. Tell us a little bit about your involvement.
Yeah, you see, myself, I am part of a minority to some extent, right? I am Hispanic. I come from South America. By now, I don't see, I see myself more as a mixture, right? A good chunk of my life has been in the United States anyway, so I'm a I am a dual citizen, and I have this dual culture in my brain, and I'm happy that my family is like that. My kids are like that. We're all bilingual, and I think that is all good. Right? The idea that you've exposed to more than just one society, and then you have all of that. So that puts your mind more to see, there is diversity in the world. There's diversity in culture, diversity in people. So, but then you come here and sometimes you don't see much diversity. For example, both in academia and in companies, one typical example of lack of diversity is when you're building teams. For example, you're in industry or in academia, you're building a new research project. And you need people, you need students, you need interns. What do you do when you need the interns? You go call the professors you know in the universities you already know. Hey, do you have cool students to send to my project? And then you don't realize that you're pre-selecting who your students will be. No, you should look much broader. You shouldn't just call your friends. You should try a much broader search. And when you broaden your search, are you really taking all of society? Are you creating a program that is attractive to men, to women, to Hispanics, to people who are Black, and so forth? So, and at the end, diversity is good because it helps drive innovation. With more diversity, you have more innovation, diversity of upbringing, diversity of perspectives. People think differently. So I do think that with diversity you gain in two ways, right? First, from a psychological and societal equal opportunity to everybody, we're all the same. But second, because innovation really benefits from diversity. So for a few years, I've been involved in many programs inside the company and some outside together with academia to help foster diversity. A good example is programs that help women in technology or women in computer science.
I found it interesting that you mentioned this dual parts of the brain because of growing up in a different land and then also being in the US for many decades. I feel that kind of mind frame is a bonus, is a positive thing to have just inside of oneself in terms of being in a creative profession. And I also feel that that experience has some analogs to the mind frame of several computer scientists and electrical engineers who belong to some of the groups that are in the minority. Because I think everyone brings something unique. So I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, exactly. So that diversity of upbringing, right? Having grown somewhere and going to another place is good. The diversity, for example, of a career, the fact that I spent a good chunk of my career in academia, a good chunk in industry, that diversity, I think, has helped me understand things better, help understand the impact of technology and research better. I do think that everything we do, and it's an everyday. It's not just say, oh, I want to do diversity. It's every day. For example, you go to a meeting and you have a meeting with researchers and engineering. And then Joe, an engineer, comes and says some idea. Oh, what if we do X? And everybody said, oh, that sounds good. And then later, Bob, a researcher, says exactly the same thing. And everybody says, "Oh, Bob, that's such a wonderful idea," because Bob is this prominent researcher, and say, "Hey, wait a second, Joe had said exactly the same thing before, but nobody paid attention because Joe is an engineer." So, and that's the kind of thing we shouldn't let happen. Or you have a meeting and there's a lot of people and there's only a couple of women, and when they want to say something, everybody else talks over them. So if I'm in one of those, without exception, I would say, "Hey, Mary, what's your opinion about that?" Bring them in. Because, everybody has good ideas, and more often than not, they will bring in ideas that will make a difference. So it's silly of us to not open to those opportunities.
The next question is, again, another hypothetical question, and it's kind of the reverse of the earlier hypothetical question that I asked. You have been through the Brazilian school system and the university system. You've experienced a little bit of the US grad school, and through your kids, you have experienced a little bit of the US schooling system as well.
Right.
How do you think your career might have been different if you had grown up in the US altogether from a very young age?
It would probably have been somewhat different in some ways, in some social ways. I'm not sure if I would pay as much attention to diversity as I do. Hopefully, I would. Hopefully, this is intrinsic in my brain. But I might have been able to do more because I didn't have to go to such a complicated path to get where I am. But I wouldn't trade it. I think the path even though it was complicated, start in Brazil, come to the US, go back to Brazil, come back to the US. But it was fun. Life is a collection of all experiences, and your career is one part of it. So I'm very grateful for that.
Okay, last question. Is there anything else that we didn't cover that you wanted to talk about?
What I would say to folks is, one is that if you're listening to this, is because you're probably involved in a career in computer science or engineering or something like that. So kudos to you. It's great to be there. First, that. Second is keep being motivated, because you can make a difference in society. And you see, the modern days are telling us that is so. There's so much opportunity for engineers and scientists and computer scientists to make a difference in society. And don't lose motivation, because keep working, because we will make a difference. Society needs us. So society has been investing in building the educational systems and the companies for that. Let's give back to society by being great engineers and delivering technology that will make our lives better.
Thank you, Rico. Thank you for sharing your life story with us and for sharing a lot of advice with us. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. In probably one of the few words that I know of Brazilian Portuguese, obrigado.
That was perfect. De nada.
On today's episode of the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast, you have heard the immigration story of Rico Malvar, National Academy of Engineering member and distinguished engineer at Microsoft. Coming up in the next episode, Dilma da Silva describes being the first engineer in her family, having 70 plus family members drop her off at the airport in Brazil when she immigrated to the US, the advantages of being a woman in science and math and engineering, and her experiences of going to and fro between Brazil and US, and to and fro between industry and academia, and of her experiences being in US industry, a professor in Brazil, and the head of a computer science department in the US. If you haven't already done so, please listen to the lead episode of this Brazil segment, that's episode 5, featuring all the 3 narrators from Brazil. All the music used in episodes of the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast is royalty-free. All voice recordings were performed with and are reproduced with full consent of narrators and participants. You can find music credits on our website. Join the online discussion about this podcast on all major social media, including Twitter and Facebook, with the handle CSImmigrant and hashtag CSImmigrant. And of course, the episode guide is available at our website, csimmigrant.org. This is the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast.